Welcome to our channel, History of Dark Souls. Everyone knows Cleopatra died by snake bite. Most picture it as something romantic. A queen defeated, a lover lost, a woman who chose death over surrender. Poetic, the stuff of legend, but that story is missing something. Cleopatra didn't fear death. She feared what came before it. She'd seen it happen to other queens. She knew exactly what Octavian had planned. When she pressed that asp, she wasn't choosing death over life. She was choosing death over what Roman victory meant for conquered queens. And that choice tells you everything about what really happened the night Rome's legions won. Roman conquest wasn't just about territory. It was about breaking spirits, erasing identities, making examples that would echo through generations. And for queens, for the women who dared rule, who commanded armies, who challenged Rome's dominance, the Romans had developed something systematic, something documented, something so brutal that even historians who recorded public crucifixions and mass executions struggled to find words. If you want to see how deep history's darkness goes, drop a comment with your city and country. Because what you're about to hear, they don't show in Hollywood. Let me show you what Cleopatra knew, what she died to avoid, starting with a queen who didn't have that choice. Her name was Zenobia, and in 272 AD she ruled an empire that made Rome nervous. She wasn't just a queen, she was a conqueror. She commanded armies, spoke multiple languages, rode into battle on horseback alongside her soldiers. And she didn't just defend her kingdom, she expanded it. Egypt fell to her forces. Parts of Asia Minor fell as well. Territories that had belonged to Rome for generations suddenly answered to a woman who called herself Augusta, a title reserved for Roman empresses. Rome didn't just hate her, they feared her, because Zenobia proved something dangerous. That Rome could be challenged, that Rome could lose, and worse, that a woman could be the one doing it. But empires don't tolerate challenges, and Emperor Aurelian was coming. The siege of Palmyra lasted months. Zenobia's forces fought hard, but Rome had more soldiers, more supplies, more time. The walls held, then they didn't. And when the city started falling, Zenobia knew what happened to queens who lost to Rome. She tried to escape, loaded supplies onto a camel and rode for the Euphrates River, hopping to cross into Persian territory where Rome couldn't follow. She almost made it. The river was in sight. Freedom was hours away. And then Roman cavalry appeared on the horizon. They surrounded her, pulled her from the camel, bound her wrists, and that night in Aurelian's camp, Zenobia learned what Roman victory actually meant. The tent was surrounded not by guards protecting her, but by soldiers who wanted revenge. She could hear them outside, hundreds of voices, drunk, angry, describing in detail what they wanted to do to the queen who had killed 70,000 Romans, what they would do if Aurelian gave permission. Her daughters were in the tent with her. Teenagers terrified, listening to the same voices, understanding the same threats. Officers came to Aurelian's tent that night. They had a question. The queen who murdered Roman soldiers, the woman who stole Roman territory, the Augusta who insulted Rome itself. What do we do with her? And some of those officers had specific suggestion. They'd earned this, hadn't they? This was spoils of war. This was justice. Let the men have one night, just one. Then she'd be broken enough for the triumph. Aurelian said no, not because of mercy, but because he needed her intact. He needed her beautiful. He needed Romans in the capital to see her walking in chains, conscious, aware, humiliated, but not destroyed. Not yet. The destruction came later. The destruction was public. So he posted guards inside her tent, not to protect her, but to protect his investment. And all night, Zenobia and her daughters listened to soldiers describing what those guards were preventing, what awaited them in Rome, what Roman victory really meant for queens who dared resist. Dawn came. The voices didn't stop. The preparation began the next day. They shaved her head first, a Roman humiliation for captives. The hair that she'd worn in elaborate styles, the hair that marked her as royalty gone. Then they stripped her of her royal garments. The silk from Persia, the gold from Egypt, the purple that proclaimed her status, all of it removed. They dressed her in a slave's tunic, coarse fabric degrading, and then came the chains. Not iron chains, but golden chains, because Rome had a sense of irony. You wanted gold, you conquered for wealth, here wear it. 60 lb of it, so heavy she couldn't lift her arms. so heavy she couldn't walk without help. The weight pulled at her wrists, cut into her flesh, made every step agony. But before they took her to Rome, there was one more thing. Her son, the one who had fought beside her, the one who had believed in her vision of an empire that could stand against Rome. Aurelian had him brought to her tent, and then he had him executed right there in front of her. They wanted her to understand, wanted her to know what happened to those who raised swords against Rome, wanted her broken before Rome ever saw her. Now she was ready. Now she understood. And now the real torture could begin. The journey to Rome took weeks. Zenobia walked in those golden chains in summer heat with no shade, no water unless Romans decided to give it. And every town they passed through, every village on the road. Crowds gathered. Word had spread. The queen who challenged Rome, the woman who thought she could be Augusta, they threw things, rotten food, stones. Worse, they shouted, called her worse, described what they'd do if they could reach her. And Zenobia walked because stopping meant being dragged, and being dragged meant more pain. Her daughters walked behind her, also in chains, also being pelted, also hearing the threats, the specific threats, the descriptions of brothel, the promises of what Roman men did to daughters of defeated queens. And finally, after weeks of this, they reached Rome. The triumph parade was scheduled, the greatest spectacle Rome could produce. Proof of Aurelian's victory. Proof that challenging Rome ended in chains. The parade begins at dawn. Zenobia stands at the starting point. Those golden chains weighing her down, cutting deeper into flesh that's already scarred from weeks of wear. She can barely stand. Slaves have to hold the chains up so she doesn't collapse under the weight. The crowd roars. Thousands of Romans line the streets. They've been waiting for this. The queen who dared. The woman who thought she could be their equal, and now look at her. The parade moves forward. Zenobia takes a step. The chains pull. She stumbles. The crowd laughs. They throw things. Rotten vegetables, feces. Stones. One hits her face. Blood runs down her cheek. She keeps walking. Every few blocks the parade stops. A senator steps forward, reads from a scroll, lists her crimes. Territory stolen, Romans killed, the audacity of calling herself Augusta. The crowd boos, screams, demands punishment, demands worse. And the soldiers who march alongside the parade, they're close enough to touch her, close enough to grab, and they do. Hands reaching through the guards, touching her, groping her, describing what they wanted to do, what they'd been denied that first night in Aurelian's camp. The guards push them back, not to protect Zenobia, but to preserve the spectacle. She has to make it to the end. She has to survive this because Rome wants to see her crawl. 5 hours of this. The heat, the weight, the pain, the humiliation, the hands, the voices. Her daughters behind her experiencing the same. Hearing the same promises about brothel, about what happens to pretty girls whose mothers lose to Rome. And Zenobia walks because what choice does she have? The parade ends at the Forum. Aurelian gives a speech. The glory of Rome, the price of resistance. He points to Zenobia. This is what happens. This is what Rome does to those who challenge us. Learn this lesson. Remember this woman. Then comes the twist. Aurelian doesn't execute her. He gives her a villa in Tivoli, a comfortable life, a pension, guards to protect her. Everything a former queen could want except freedom. This is Rome's mercy. This is what submission earns you. Fight us and you walk in golden chains, but survive the walk and we'll let you live in comfort as our trophy, our proof that resistance ends in surrender. Zenobia lives there for years in that villa with those guards, never allowed to leave, never allowed to return home. Never allowed to forget that she's alive because Rome permits it. Some sources claim Aurelian forced her to marry a Roman senator. Not love, not choice. A final humiliation. The queen who ruled the East now belongs to Rome completely. Even her body, even that. And Rome watches and Rome learns. This is mercy. This is what happens when you're lucky. When Aurelian likes you. When Rome decides to be generous. But most conquered queens weren't lucky. Most didn't get villas. Most got what Zenobia spent that first night hearing about. What those soldiers wanted to do. What Rome's victory really meant. Let me show you the pattern, the system, what Rome did when mercy wasn't on the table. 50 years before Zenobia, there was a man named Vercingetorix, GIC leader, who united the tribes and nearly defeated Julius Caesar, but nearly isn't a victory. and Caesar didn't accept anything less than total surrender. When Alissa fell, Caesar made his terms clear. Vercingetorix could surrender himself and spare his people or watch everyone die. Vercingetorix chose surrender, walked out of that fortress in chains, thought he was saving lives. His wife thought so too. His children, they watched him go. Believed Caesar's promise that surrender meant life. Caesar lied. The moment Vercingetorix was secured, Caesar's officers moved in, seized the family, separated them. The wife never saw her husband again. Didn't know he'd spend 6 years in a Roman prison before being strangled during Caesar's triumph. Didn't know because she'd already been distributed. That's the word they used. Distributed like supplies, like equipment. Defeated leader families were rewards for officers, payment for service, spoils of war. Vercingetorix's wife became the property of one of Caesar's commanders. Not a servant, not a slave in the household sense. A concubina captiva, a captive concubine, which meant exactly what it sounds like. She had no choice, no voice, no rights. That first night, still in the clothes she'd worn, watching her husband surrender, she belonged to a Roman officer who'd earned her through conquest, and the children separated sold. Sons became slaves or gladiators. Daughters went to whoever paid. The family that Vercingetorix thought he'd saved by surrendering was erased within days. This wasn't cruelty. This was policy. Standard practice documented in Caesar's own writings. Matter of fact, no drama, just the business of empire. Defeated leaders' families were assets distributed accordingly. But here's the thing. Rome didn't just do this after defeat. Sometimes they did it before as a warning, as psychological warfare to show what happened to those who resisted. Ask Boudicca. Boudicca was a British queen. Her husband had an arrangement with Rome, a client kingdom, autonomy in exchange for tribute. Then he died and Rome decided they wanted more than tribute. They wanted the kingdom. Boudicca refused. This was her land, her people, her daughter's inheritance. Rome had no right. Rome disagreed and Rome sent soldiers to explain their disagreement. They came to her home. These weren't negotiators. These were enforcers, and they didn't come to talk. They flogged Boudicca publicly in front of her people. Stripped her, beat her, made sure everyone watched, made sure everyone understood. This is what happens when you say no to Rome. But that wasn't the worst part. Her daughters, teenagers, Rome soldiers took them right there in front of Boudicca, in front of her people, in front of everyone who needed to learn what Roman conquest meant. And they victimized them, both of them. Not hidden, not quietly. This was a theater. This was a message. This is what happens to the daughters of queens who resist. This is what Rome does to those who think they have rights. Tacitus wrote about it specifically, documented it, because it was so horrific that even Romans who'd seen everything found it notable, found it worth recording. That's how bad it was. Boudicca didn't start the rebellion because she wanted to. She started it because Rome had already done the worst thing imaginable. What was left to fear? What could Rome do that was worse than what they'd already done? So she burned them. 3 Roman cities. 70,000 Romans died. Londinium burned to ashes. And when she knew she'd lost, when the final battle turned against her, she didn't wait for capture. She took poison because she'd seen what capture meant, had experienced what Rome did to queens, had watched her daughters suffer it. Death was mercy compared to Roman victory. And Cleopatra knew all of this. Every story, every fate, every example. She knew about defeated leaders' families, about distribution, about what happened to women who fought Rome. And she knew what Octavian had planned for her specifically because Octavian wasn't subtle. He wanted her for his triumph, wanted Rome to see Egypt's queen in chains, wanted to parade her the way Aurelian had paraded Zenobia. But there was more, because Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was the woman who'd seduced Julius Caesar, who'd seduced Mark Antony, who'd used her beauty and her body to manipulate Roman generals. Or so the story went. So Roman propaganda claimed. And Octavian wanted to punish that too. The triumph he'd planned, the one Cleopatra would walk in chains. It wasn't just about Egypt. It was about humiliation, sexual humiliation. The horror of Caesar and Antony displayed, possibly naked, definitely degraded. Rome's revenge for daring to use sexuality as power. And after the triumph, after the parade ended and the crowds went home, Octavian had plans for that too. She wouldn't be executed like male captives. She'd be kept displayed, a permanent reminder, possibly forced into marriage, definitely controlled. Her body, her image, her everything, and her children. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, would die immediately. Too dangerous, a threat to Octavian's legitimacy. He'd be executed first, and Cleopatra would know, would watch, would understand. Her other children, the twins with Antony, would live. But as Romans raised to forget Egypt, forced to deny their mother, their heritage, everything that made them who they were, Cleopatra looks at the asp, the snake coiled in the basket, the bite that will stop her heart, the death that will end the pain before it begins. She thinks about every queen who'd faced Roman victory and learned what it really meant. Death isn't defeat. Death is defiance. Death is the one thing Rome can't control, the one choice they can't take. She presses the snake to her skin, feels the bite, the venom, the numbness spreading, and she dies free, dies a queen, dies Egyptian, never walks in Octavian's triumph, never wears his chains, never becomes his trophy. Rome doesn't get her body, doesn't get her image, doesn't get the spectacle they wanted. All they get is a corpse. And you can't parade a corpse the same way. You can't humiliate the dead. Her choice proves everything, proves how bad it really was. Because Cleopatra wasn't weak, wasn't defeated, wasn't broken. She was strong enough to choose death, and she chose it instantly, without hesitation. That's how terrifying Roman victory was. That's what awaited conquered queens. That's the night they feared most. But Cleopatra at least heard the story secondhand. She learned from other women's suffering. Some queens didn't have that luxury. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, walked in Caesar's triumph 30 years before Cleopatra died. She was 17, young, beautiful, terrified. Caesar paraded her through Roman chains, in front of crowds who screamed insults, who threw things, who described what they wanted to do to her. But Caesar's triumph that year included other captives, too. Other queens, other noble women from conquered territories, and some of them, the ones who weren't valuable enough, who weren't famous enough, who weren't worth preserving for political reasons. Some of them got what the soldiers wanted. Arsinoe heard the screams, understood what was happening, knew she was lucky that being Caesar's captive, being famous, being Cleopatra's sister, that's what saved her from the same fate. She was exiled to Ephesus instead. A temple, priestess duties, celibacy, which sounded like mercy after what she'd witnessed. But the sources say she never spoke again, never smiled, lived in that temple like a ghost, completely broken by what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd almost experienced. Years later, Cleopatra had her assassinated. Not cruelty, but strategy. Because Arsinoe had walked in a Roman triumph, had been displayed, had been broken, which made her useful to Rome, a puppet queen who'd do anything to avoid being paraded again. Cleopatra learned from that. Learned that even survival was trauma. That even mercy destroyed. That Roman victory broke you whether you lived or died. And some queens went through worse. Thus, Nlda was a Germanic queen married to Arminius, the man who destroyed 3 Roman legions at Tudburg Forest. Rome's greatest military disaster, Rome's shame. Rome wanted revenge, wanted Arminius, but they got Thucylda instead. She was 7 months pregnant when they captured her, and Rome loved that detail because it wasn't just her they'd conquered. It was her unborn child, too. The next generation, the bloodline. They paraded her pregnant, made her walk in chains in her condition through Rome's streets with the crowds shouting about how even her baby belonged to Rome now, how nothing escaped, how complete their victory was. She gave birth in captivity in chains in a Roman prison, and they took the baby immediately. Didn't let her hold him, didn't let her name him, took him and raised him as a Roman, as a gladiator, someone to die in the arena for Roman entertainment. She was forced to watch years later. Her son, the one she'd carried while walking in chains, fighting in the Colosseum, dying there, and she could never speak to him. Her husband, Arminius, was alive and free, fighting Rome from across the border. And he knew his wife was a prisoner, knew his son was being raised as a gladiator, but he could do nothing. That's psychological warfare. That's torture. And that's what Rome did systematically, not to one queen, but to hundreds. When Rome defeated the Cimbrian Teutones in 101 BC, they captured 60,000 women. 60,000 distributed them among the legions. Officers chose first. Soldiers drew lots for the rest. An entire population of women erased, distributed, owned, and many of them chose death. Plutarch documented it. Hundreds of women hanging themselves, trying to kill their children first. It was mercy because they knew what awaited them. Rome prevented it when they could. Stop the suicides. Save the women, not kindness but property protection. These women had value as slaves, as concubines, as warnings. This was the system, this was policy, this was what Rome did after victory. Break the men in battle, break the women after, use both as examples, make sure everyone everywhere understood. You cannot win against Rome, and losing means worse than death. Zenobia got a villa because Aurelian needed propaganda. Vercinge's wife got distributed because Caesar didn't. Boudicca's daughters got victimized because Rome wanted Britain terrified. Cleopatra got the choice to die because she moved fast enough. Arsinoe got trauma. Thus, Nda got her son stolen. The Cimber women got erased. Different fates, same system, same empire, same message. Resist Rome and this is the night you'll fear. Not the battle, not the siege, not the defeat, the victory. Roman victory. When the fighting stops and the doors close and the chains come out and the soldiers remember everything you did to them, that's the night conquered queens feared most. And that fear, that knowledge, that understanding of what waited. That's why Cleopatra chose the snake. Because death was freedom, death was mercy. Death was the only victory left. And if you understand that, if you understand why the most powerful queen in the ancient world looked at a snake and saw salvation, then you understand what Rome really was. Not marble and glory, not civilization and law. A machine that ground people into lessons, that turned queens into warnings, that made death look like kindness. And it worked for centuries because everyone knew, everyone understood. Everyone learned from the examples, from the golden chains, from the distributed families, from the victimized daughters, from the stolen sons. You could not win, and losing meant this, always this. That's the story they don't tell. That's the truth behind the marble statues. That's what Roman conquest actually meant. The night conquered queens feared most was the night Rome won. And now you know why.